You're listening to RevOps FM with Justin Norris. Welcome to RevOps FM, everyone. Big day on the show today as we chat with someone who really needs no introduction. It is Scott Brinker, VP of Platform Ecosystem at HubSpot, editor at chiefmartech.com, and creator of the famous marketing technology landscape supergraphic. Now, Scott has just released a new report called Martech for 2025, and as you might expect, it's all about how AI is reshaping the marketing and Martech environment. And it's just under a year ago that we've done our first episode on the impact of AI in marketing. So I thought this is a great time to check in, see how things have evolved in the past 12 months and how AI is going to change your job in the years to come. And Scott is going to be our guide. Scott, it is a pleasure to have you on the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Fun topics. Looking forward to this.
It is. Now, Scott, I understand your cocktail party trick is that you can recite all 14,000 vendors from the Martech landscape graphic by heart. Is this true?
Yeah, and I can even draw their logos from memory.
It is an amazing talent, and my hat goes off to you for maintaining that now. For how many years is it now that you've been producing that graphic?
Yeah, so it's over a 14-year period. We took 1 year off back in 2012, I think. Yeah, but yeah, it's just been growing crazy ever since.
Well, it is become an amazing sort of pillar of our ecosystem. So thank you for the work that you do there. On this year's report on Martech in 2025, maybe let's just start with the bottom line up front. Like, what are the top 1 to 2 messages you would like Mops Pros to take away from this report?
Wow. Well, I think at the end of the day, we all know marketing is changing, both at a technical level of like the capabilities, the products we use, what AI is making possible for us as marketers to do. But it's also very clearly shifting the dynamics for how buyers are going to want to engage with us. It's one of the things, just to like pick some random thing we could look at that in previous years would have been an entire year's worth of content. And in this year, we're like, oh yeah, by the way, it turns out that maybe Google search is going to be disrupted by these other channels in which people are going to go and just directly get answers to questions. We're like, yeah, that's one of the 15 or 20 major disruptions that I'm looking at the moment. Thank you very much. But again, while I know I don't want to sound flippant about it because I know it's a stressful thing for people when you've got all these changes and you're trying to keep up. And if there's any consolation, it's that everyone's in the same boat. Everyone is trying to keep up with these changes. But I always take this optimistic view that these sorts of disruptions are actually a gift to, in particular, marketers. Marketing is always about differentiation. It's always about standing out from the crowd. And when you've ended up in a market or an environment where sort of everything is sort of converged down to like a common playbook and common channels and common approaches, it's actually really, really hard to stand out. But when you're in these moments of disruption where things are changing, I think those sorts of marketers who are willing to be a little bit bold and push out on the frontier and experiment with it, it becomes a really great opportunity for them to differentiate. So yes, there's a whole bunch of ways in which, marketing and Martech is changing, but it's actually a great opportunity.
One of the risks, concerns, I don't know how we want to phrase it, but one of the things that I've felt and seen other people express is, if everyone's using ChatGPT to write their copy, everyone kind of sounds the same. So it's interesting that you poke on it as an opportunity for differentiation. How do you think companies can use AI to actually be different, to stand out?
Yeah. Well, I would argue just using ChatGPT out of the box to write my blog articles the same way everyone else is, that is that same sort of pattern we've seen of I guess if you publish a top 10 listicle on keyword X, there's always a formulaic approach to these things that, sadly, a lot of, sort of companies, a lot of marketers fall into the trap of, but very few of those things started out that way. There was someone who actually invented the listicle who hey, wow, this is actually a way to this resonates with folks. Oh, I could do a series of these. Andrew Chen, who has had a number of different roles, as a VC up to growth for Uber. He had a phrase he had invented, the law of shitty click-throughs. Which is basically this idea that, marketing, particularly in the digital space, is this continuous sequence of, okay, a marketer coming up with some sort of novel way of breaking through and engaging. And it works. Like, it's like this incredible like return because it's not been done before. And the word starts to leak out and then other people start to do it. And basically, eventually over time, the efficacy drops and it reverts to the mean. And you have to come up with another one. And so, yeah, there's definitely a lot of that with AI. I think, the folks who are going to be creative with generative AI aren't just saying like, oh yeah, ChatGPT, write my blog article for me, because nobody's going to be reading those blog articles. I mean, like if we produce like 100 times more, blog articles, we have not invented 100 times more human attention, for people to actually consume these things. In fact, if anything, there's sort of the indication now that, the recipients on the other side here, they're kind of savvy on this. They're leaning into AI like, hey, this huge stream of emails that you sent me, can you just summarize that in a few bullet points for me and let me know if there's anything particular I should pay attention to? So I think the creative marketers are looking at generative AI or AI more broadly, not about just how do we churn out more of the same kind of articles, but how do we do something different with this?
On that note, your survey suggested like at least 80% of marketers, if I interpreted the results correctly, at least 80% of marketers are using AI in some fashion. And it looked like at least half of them daily or weekly, which I think is huge, like compared to where we were a year ago, where it felt like people were still like, what do we do with this? And what is this thing? But drilling down on that creativity, do you have a sense, could be database, could be intuition based, like the impact of this AI adoption? Is it mainly efficiency right now, or are there marketers out there that you've seen who are actually being able to produce better marketing as a result of doing this than they otherwise could?
There's a little bit of a blending between the efficiency and the innovation side. For instance, when I think about it this way, okay, so like the efficiency would just be like, okay, well, we can do this thing faster, or we can do it less expensive. Not bad, but here's where it sort of like plays into the degree to which you're able to turn that from an efficiency into a true innovation thing. Is it starts with like the questions, the hypotheses. What are the experiments that I want to run? Well, historically, for marketers who weren't necessarily data scientists or data engineers, like being able to go deeper into their data, to answer some of these questions, to get data to feed some of their hypotheses, very often involved this cycle of filing tickets and have an analyst track that down, and so there's a whole set of some of these, new AI tools, and many of them are early, but they're developing very quickly. That is democratizing the ability for marketers to be able to ask more questions of their data and have to come back with answers immediately, sort of taking out, that whole like multi-day or in some case multi-week, analyst cycle. Now you could say that's the thing about efficiency. It is, but to me, marketers, like one of their superpowers is their imagination. That's just like constant, like coming up with questions and ideas, the vast majority of which we've kind of been trained to just like let go of because we're like, oh yeah, no, it's just going to take too much work to get that answer. So, I don't care, but as we sort of, reduce the number of things that feel out of reach, to be able to like ask more and more questions and get answers and like chase those ideas down, I think that actually helps unlock new creativity and new ideas. Same thing when we talk about the actual implementation. When we compress the time and cost to be able to produce things, this isn't just about saying like, oh, well, I was going to produce 10 things, and I was going to spend a week on it. Now I can produce 10 things and I can do it in 2 days. Oh, okay, great. I'm more efficient. It's really like, okay, now for that extra 3 days, like, what do? Can I produce more things? And it's that produce more things, which is where you get that inflection from like, okay, wait a second, this isn't necessarily just about efficiency, because as long as you're not saying, well, I'm just going to produce more of the same sort of thing, but you're going to be like, oh, well, let me try some other experiments. Let me like, I've got a little bit of time. Let me, I have this kind of wild idea. I've got time now. I have the ability to do this. Let me like create this and put this out there, so I think like harnessing that time, is another way. And then the third one is, and we've seen this direction headed for a while with some of these no-code tools, but now generative AI it's almost like bringing a sort of no-code capability to so many disciplines, with, images. We're starting to see some really cool stuff emerge here in video creation and things like this. is it democratizes ability for people who have an idea to actually like instantiate it, make it real, and even if you want to be modest about it and say like, oh, well, maybe some of this stuff isn't ready to go from idea to, production ready final version. If it's to go from idea to something that's a pretty darn good representation of what it could be, to be able to get reactions to that, and use that as a guide for developing the production ready version one. Again, is this an efficiency thing? Yes, because I didn't necessarily need the full team to even like put together a prototype concept. But it's that empowerment to create these prototype ideas, just pretty much at the speed of thought. That is a huge unlock from an innovation perspective. Oh my goodness, it's like fuel for the imagination.
And you've multiplied your ability to iterate, to your point, to try more ideas, or to spend that time doing deep human work that maybe you usually would not have time for in a typically overloaded calendar.
Yeah. You talk about like what you could do with the additional hours in the day, and certainly more experiments and more ideas, but for the human work, how about spending more time just talking with customers? We know as marketers, like that's a big part of our job. I know a lot of marketers who don't get a lot of time actually being able to talk with customers, to be able to have that sort of like human connection and human insight that they feed in to their imagination. So I think you're right. Like that sort of human work, boy, if we could get 10, 20% more of our week, allocated to that, that would be a huge gift.
One of the first things in your report is a graphic of the hype cycle. I will include a link to the report so people can look on this, but it has that peak of inflated expectations, that trough of disillusionment, and the gradually increasing up to the plateau of productivity. And I can feel riding that over the past year from like, whoa, AI, AI SDRs, they suck. And then gradually I find myself now, you mentioned about disrupting Google. I've started to ask ChatGPT things instead of Googling them. Like it's actually, I don't do it on purpose. It's just, this is a more efficient way to get my information. Or I have Grok on my phone, and yesterday there was a battery with some words in French and I didn't understand it. And I just took a picture and said, can you translate this text for me? Translated the text. Like it's starting to work its way in. So like, where do you think we are on that curve? Where would you peg us? Obviously everyone's at different places personally, but as a collective, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's challenging to answer that for two reasons. One is I'm convinced there isn't actually one hype curve here, but like there's a multitude of different hype curves all at different stages. Again, like with, just take some of the stuff here with like OpenAI. Where are we at as far as our comfort level in using ChatGPT to help us brainstorm or help us like edit some of our writing? I think we're actually now pretty far into the, plateau of productivity. Most people are pretty comfortable with it. It's pretty good at that. Where are we on using it as a search engine? I don't know. Probably at this exact moment, given the announcements, happening, right now, we're probably at the peak of hype of like, oh my goodness, it's going to disrupt everything. There'll be a trough. Where are we at on the, ability from OpenAI with things like Sora and, there's video creation stuff? Probably very early on in the technology triggers. And so it's interesting because for one thing, there's just multiple hype curves at different stages. But the other thing is, this is the thing about the hype curve I've just noticed over the years. And again, kudos to Gartner for like identifying this pattern and like articulating it, in such an excellent way. But it used to be, I've got some gray hair here. It used to be that these hype curves were something that played out over between a 5 to 10 year period. In fact, this is how like the tech industry was structured. This is how venture capital was built to do this. But slowly, if I was that thing, it happened gradually and then all at once, slowly over time, like it's compressed. Like instead of taking 5 to 10 years to go through this, maybe it's more like, 4 to 6 years. Things like in marketing, the customer data platform, revolution. I feel like that thing like barely got started in like 2015, 2016, and now we're already at the thing of like, well, CDPs, are they a thing now? Or is this all the data? And you're like, wait a second, this thing was like barely getting started. Like what? Now we're on to some next new, architecture. it feels like in AI, it's compressed that hype curve down to something that really is more about months than years. I kept feeling like, even in the first year or so of ChatGPT, you'd be like, okay, well, yeah, this thing is really great, but its data is, 2 years old. And then they connect it up to the web and you're like, okay, all right, well, I guess that's all. Yeah, it's really good, but it can't do math problems. Oh, well, now we connected and it can run little Python programs and calculate that. And you're like, okay, well, like everything I thought was this barrier that would be this multi-year thing kind of vanished after a couple of months, and so I think it just makes it really hard to say yeah, the hype curve is still a thing, but where are we and how quickly will we move along? Boy, I don't know.
You mentioned the book, The Innovator's Dilemma, a number of times in your report. And in that book, the author talks about how he studied the disk drive industry because of this fruit fly effect, where it was a very fast moving industry. So you could observe the life cycle. And he's passed away, obviously, but he was here looking at these very compressed cycles that we're going through now. It is like watching life almost on 1.5x, the way you can with a YouTube video, where you see things moving very quickly, businesses starting, trends coming and going.
Yeah. No, and such a brilliant Clay Christensen, the whole innovator's dilemma. But this thing about disruptive innovation, boy, you just see it this perfectly thing. His big insight there was, so often these disruptions would happen from below, where it would end up empowering a set of people to do things who, quite frankly, it wasn't cost effective for them to do things the old way. The great example would be coding. Okay, well, if I needed to build a software program, not too long ago, all right, well, I've got to hire multiple engineers. I'm going to need this. It's okay. So if I want to do a simple little program to go fetch me some stock market data and graph, I'm nah, it's just not worth doing that, and then you have these disruptive innovations that come along that they're maybe not yet at the level where they can do the sorts of things that software engineers do from a, sophisticated perspective. But for these low end use cases, they work friggin' beautifully, and they unlock that capability for all these people who before didn't even have the option to get things done. So big fan of Christensen. This is his time. If he's watching this from above, he's yep.
But part of that dynamic that he describes about the innovation coming from above, you start to address it a little bit in the different segments. And maybe you can walk us through them a little bit, but the segments that you kind of spell out are these indie tools, bubbling up, using AI, innovating very rapidly, these challenger platforms that are kind of threatening the big incumbents and consolidating a number of different abilities. The incumbents, who are quickly trying to add AI as fast as they can onto their platforms. And then won't even touch services as a software yet. But then you also talk, as you just addressed, this custom apps idea that actually I can just build it myself now with ChatGPT. Help maybe amend or add anything you'd like to my explanation of that landscape. And then perhaps where are you seeing the most fruitful innovation right now in all of those segments?
Well, I would start by saying, in any period of disruption, we're used to thinking of sort of the battle between startups and incumbents, and one of the reasons why we made a distinction in sort of the startup segment between this idea of these indie tools versus the challenger platforms is because so many of these new AI tools that have popped up aren't actually looking to displace the major incumbent platforms. In many cases, they now integrate with those platforms. They're complementary to those platforms. And so it's a little bit again, not to say there won't be overlap and exchange back and forth, but in many ways, the complementary nature there seems to exceed the competitive nature, at least at this stage of the game. Versus there are a set of challenger platforms that are very much looking at this inflection point of oh yeah, we're bringing down Salesforce, and that's a hard hill to climb, but this is the nature of the tech industry. Some of those folks are actually going to climb that hill and, disrupt the incumbents they're going after, so that's that sort of central, the commercial, Martech landscape, where we're seeing those groups. The thing about the custom software is because AI is really, already the barriers to entry in creating software, the cost of creating software was already like plummeting, given cloud, given frameworks, given, AWS services of every flavor you can. I mean, it was already like headed down, like more people could do it than ever. But now with these AI co-pilots and increasingly, we might talk a bit about how AI agents are able to even create code without you knowing that they were creating code for you. It's just further accelerated this ability for like companies to be able to create more and more software themselves. Now, will that be a total replacement to those commercial products? My sense is in the foreseeable future, probably not. With due credit to, Klarna, ripping out Salesforce and Workday and all these other ones. But, they're in a league of their own. But what I think of it is more of another one of these complementary components where like, okay, yeah, there are certain capabilities on the market that it wouldn't make sense for me to like reinvent the wheel, right? Like, I don't need to write my own email server at this point. That's not a comparative advantage, for most companies. But when it comes to how I want to design a particular customer experience or the way in which I want to optimize a particular workflow, from quote to cash, that actually might be something that I would want to custom develop the way in which that works, the way in which that experience is delivered. Now I can do that on top of those commercial platforms, but I'm now leveraging AI to be able to accelerate the customization that I build on top of it.
Incumbents have often, in my experience, struggled with adding that innovation. And I mean, there's many potential reasons. Part of it is maybe they just are not as laser focused on that one problem. But it's always seemed counterintuitive to me that like, two developers in a bedroom somewhere can produce something that is a bit closer to the pulse of the market than some of these big legacy platforms that I've owned and used with all these resources who just seem to miss the mark. And some of that, you've mentioned, they have backwards compatibility, dependence on existing revenue structures. There's a lot of the innovator's dilemma stuff. And then part of it, to me, it almost feels like a mindset thing where somehow a dysfunction creeps in at larger scale where they seem unable of the focus or of the creative leaps that are required to innovate at the level that sort of the young blood can. I wonder, do you share that experience? I'll say as a notable exception, I'm not just saying because you're on the show, but HubSpot almost feels to me to be an exception to that rule. And I don't know how they've continued to innovate the way that they seem to have been able to do at the scale that they're at. But a lot of other companies, and I come from the Marketo ecosystem, they have not been able to do that. Like Eloqua has not been able to, a lot of these players. What is your take on this issue about innovation within legacy incumbents and how can it flourish? Is it possible?
There's a quote, and I wish I could remember who said it. I believe it was a partner at Andreessen Horowitz, that it's like, it's a race between will the startups get distribution before the incumbents get innovation. I think this time is a little bit different, for a couple reasons. First of all, is this pattern of innovator's dilemma, like disruption from below. Everyone's now sort of read those books. You have a whole generation, of executives at these incumbent companies that perhaps a number of them actually were the disruptors, from a previous generation. And so I find when talking to, execs across the industry, they're pretty darn tuned into that. Like they really do see that as the existential threat. They're not screwing around on it. And then also it's almost because the AI wave has been so forceful and so fast. I mean, if it was happening just a little bit slower, it'd be sort of easier to say like, all right, we'll get to that next year. We've got, the main thing we need to ship this year. There's just no illusion of that. Everyone basically looks at it and says like, this is changing the game. This is going to change everything, about how software actually works. And so given that, forceful momentum, and then, the fact that a lot of the leaders at these companies do recognize that, if we lose this, we're going to lose it because we let, someone disrupt us, from below on this. Is I think companies are like attacking this with much greater ferocity than historically they have. Now, That being said, there are still there are structural advantages and structural disadvantages, that large companies have. And I don't think there's a silver bullet to it, but I think we're going to see through this next cycle of the next 5 years, which ones of the incumbents actually successfully made the transitions and which ones didn't. And they're going to become the, business school case studies of okay, here's how you fend this off. I mean, at the end of the day, it's, we started with Christensen, we end with Christensen. It's you have to be willing to disrupt yourself, and I mean, I'll, give a shout out here to, the HubSpot competitor, I think Benioff, and basically taking all of Dreamforce, being nah, it's not Salesforce, it's Agentforce, my God, was that a ballsy move? Now, how that plays out, how it delivers on it. All right. I'm not for me to comment at this point, but I mean, that sort of willingness to disrupt, all of your existing plans, all of your existing narrative, go to market. That's the sort of thing that I think Christensen would be impressed and be okay, yeah, no, not shy about disrupting the previous model, to make it to the next wave.
And just to close the loop on your point, the latest edition of Innovator's Dilemma has a foreword by Benioff. So,
see, okay, yeah.
So it's just to underscore your point about the latest, the disruptors who have internalized the message, and maybe we've seen sort of the end of history then of that pattern repeating. And in terms of the actual implementation, I think we all saw in 2024, we need to get our AI features out the door. What are we going to do? Almost like a solution in search of a problem in a way. We have AI, we need to figure out what we're going to do with it and how we're going to add our features. And so we saw these features come out, and I've used some of them in the tools that I've had, and some of them have been really interesting. A few of them have been good. Some of them have been kind of I see what you're trying to do, but not so much. One of the things I've observed just personally is a bit of a last mile effect. We are recording this using the tool Descript. It's a great tool. I use it to record and edit my podcast. They have a feature, just as an example, remove ums and ahs. Oh, amazing. This takes me hours. I just push this button, remove ums and ahs. And it does a pretty good job, but then, 5% of the time, it clips a word. It makes it weird. So either you're okay with that and you're willing to tolerate that, or you still have to review the whole thing anyways. And so it's almost that last mile is enough to it's just not quite there. Do you think, is this a fly in the ointment and we will outgrow it? Or do you think there is something deeper there that companies need to address to be successful as AI software companies?
Yeah. And I think this is one where it's probably incredibly use case dependent, on what they, both, what is it? It's a question of both how much tolerance is there for error? And then, what is the speed by which asymptotically you're reducing the error down to where it falls below that threshold, that you're concerned about. I do think video, audio, any of these things that are human representations. I mean, they have the phrase for this, the uncanny valley. Yep. We see this now with some of these video avatar things where, hey, I can have the Scott Brinker avatar that I just then feed it text and it will have me saying whatever crazy text I want. It's good. I mean, from a technological perspective, it's a friggin' wonder, but it's still pretty clear, nah, this is not a real person. And even if you weren't super paying attention to that, just something would seem off, Now, will we get past that? I kind of suspect we will. And I think in the meantime, a lot of those things, again, everyone has their own choices. I wouldn't use them, for production purposes, but am I comfortable using it to say clean up certain amounts of audio background noise? Yeah, it seems to do in general a phenomenal job.
I think you're right. I think you're right. And it's I can't remember if this was in your report or something else I was listening to, but it's it doesn't work, and all of a sudden it works and it's normal. It's just well, yes, of course, this will be the way. And I think that'll, like you said, with the ums and ahs or something like that, it'll eventually go below that threshold of acceptability of error tolerance, and then life will never be the same. Let's talk a little bit about AI agents. This was a concept that I I kind of thought that I understood. And then as I read this section was the area where I realized my understanding was quite superficial in terms of like, oh, I actually didn't really understand what we meant by that and about this idea of a large action model and the real implications of an agent. So maybe, assuming there's probably other listeners that are in that position as well, do you walk us through this and what it means and what the implications are maybe for how we will use them?
Yeah, happy to do that with the caveat that, if you ask 100 AI experts for their definition of an agent, probably get at least 120 different explanations. I think the oversimplified version is almost like an automation. It's this ability to simply say like, I'm going to make a request of this software app, software agent. It's going to go off. It's going to perform that request, come back and deliver it to me. I think one of the examples I pointed to here was Dharmesh Shah, co-founder of HubSpot. He's created as one of his many projects that he goes off and does. I've been a constant wonder of this fellow, Agent AI, which is a whole bunch of these like very purpose-built, agents that they go off and they do one thing and they do it really well. I think if you ask others, what makes something an agent is the ability for it to have almost a little bit more of an internalization of how it goes about making decisions. So you give it a higher level goal, it starts to reason about, okay, well, how would I accomplish that goal? I would break it down into these different steps. I would take this first step based on the results of that. I would adjust, move to the second step, and I think this is where people get most excited because as you start looking at agents through that lens, it's not just about things that are almost like these, very purpose-specific tools, but they start to become things that I'm not quite sure I'm ready to call them digital coworkers, but they become like, these more autonomous support capabilities for what we do. But I think this is where things get really interesting is because, okay, we're used to starting to have this interaction with ChatGPT just from a conversational perspective. And particularly with some of the latest frontier models on these LLMs, you can actually see them do the reasoning and you can ask them and you're like, I could kind of figure out a plan for this. The leap from that conversational AI to truly being an agent is like, okay, well, now I've empowered this thing to take action out in the world. And some of the most recent announcements from folks like Anthropic and OpenAI are about, giving these LLMs the ability to, I think what Anthropic calls it like computer use. It's this idea that you can start to try and like operate some of your software for you. I think that stuff's really interesting. But to me, when I look at the greatest opportunity for agents to be put into production, it's less about having them work with software the way we humans would work with software, like, oh, yes, navigate to this menu choice and drop down here and pick this and fill out these 3 form fields. Not that it is impossible, but it's frankly, a really circuitous way, for a computer to interact with other computer systems to be able to get things done. The way in which we do that is we do it through APIs, and this is the thing that is very exciting for me is this rise of the AI intelligence to create agents is happening at the same time that we've been on a pretty good streak for the past decade of more and more software is now built with open APIs. This was a function of we ended up with these heterogeneous tech stacks. People needed to integrate things together. How do you integrate it together? Well, you have APIs that can talk to each other. We have whole software categories, integration platform as a service, built around that capability. And without going out on my soapbox of why APIs are such an amazing thing for, I wish more software vendors did a better job with more APIs. They're at least headed in the right direction. I think having that converge with this AI intelligence for agents to then be able to take actions through those APIs is that combination is going to just unlock a tremendous amount of creative value.
Is the agent an AI of a kind of different nature than what we're getting when we're chatting with ChatGPT? Or is it more just, it's like ChatGPT with lots of extra context, empowered to take action through APIs or through access to interfaces?
I think the thing that takes it one step further is the ability for it to be a feedback loop. I mean, like if you have an agent, it's not just about like, oh, it comes to a plan it can kind of have done that already. All right. Now the next step was, okay, it can take action on that plan. It can call, these APIs, or in a more primitive sense, can like manipulate the computer UI for you. But then the step beyond that gets really interesting is it can then feed back into its decisioning what happened as a result. Oh, this is the result I got. That was not what I expected. Okay, let me adjust my plan and I'm going to try this other thing. Or, hey, wow, this looks like this is a problem. I want to flag this and create an exception, for someone, that sort of feedback loop. And again, this is all very early with people experimenting with stuff. But I think that's what starts to make this really powerful because, again, over the past 10 years, automation has been one of those themes that's made its way through pretty much every facet of the tech stack, but certainly in RevOps, marketing ops, sales ops, right? I mean, marketing automation platforms, the very name of these products, are about automation at the center of it. But a lot of it's been this very deterministic, rules-based automation. And where things get dicey is when something goes wrong or it doesn't work quite as expected. Usually then we've had to sort of like service that up to then the human administrator to figure it out, to allow these AI agents to be in a position where they can kind of figure it out for themselves. Boy, that's a huge breakthrough.
Maybe if you'll indulge me in a thought experiment, because it's just a really interesting thing. Something in marketing operations that is a common task, building out some kind of campaign or program or email within a marketing automation platform, whether that's Marketo or HubSpot or something else. Quite often we have internal service resources or teams that do that. So a marketer says, hey, I want an email. They do a ticket. Someone on the marketing ops team will go and build that for them. What would be involved if we wanted to make an agent to replace that, which it sounds like we could, whether the agent was using APIs, which many of these tasks are possible through APIs, or had to do it through the interface? Like, how do you even get started if someone wanted to do that?
Whatever the plan would have been for the human marketing ops person, that would have done that work, like, is that a set of steps that an agent could actually, take over? All right, well, so I've got to is it getting full copy or is it only getting sort of a framework? Does it adjust it? Does it check it up against, brand voice? Okay. Now, do I think about okay, who am I doing for audience selection? Who's the list? What should be the criteria for that? Okay, now I've, got my email, what's the right delivery schedule, for these folks? Are there other competing, messages? How do we make sure, we've got the right throttling on that? I don't know, maybe there's things of a check of the accessibility. There's a whole series of things that you could imagine us doing that with more traditional automation. It's just some of these things were so qualitative in how they needed to be evaluated, and traditional, machine learning automation AI just wasn't quite able to capture that as well as, these LLMs have almost the mirror opposite. They're particularly good at some of those squishy qualitative things. I think if you mirror those two things, yeah, it wouldn't at all surprise me, to have more and more of these agents show up that can, kind of take a ticket from a marketer, basically roll together, the whole campaign, presumably for at least some time here, then present it to a human who will review it, make sure okay, yeah, this is, what I wanted. But if that reduces the work and the time involved in putting one of those campaigns together from, again, 3 days to 3 hours, it's a huge, huge leap.
Well, and the fascinating thing about that for me is every tool is putting their own little AI features in place. I use Zapier, and you can go and build a Zap the traditional way, drag your little things in and configure them, or you can type something in and be and do it. And it's doing an okay job of doing that. But quite often as a professional in that, I'm maybe more inclined to just do it myself a lot of the time. But if every tool has those little things, you're still needing a human there to stitch it all together. But now you have this agent that is kind of outside of all those systems, but can interact with all of them. That's trained on your brand and company specific policies and procedures, and can chat with the marketer on your behalf and then go out and execute and take feedback and make changes. That's fairly revolutionary. Do you think that all the systems are in place to do that today, or are we still a step or two away from an agent being that autonomous?
Yeah, I think a lot of the ingredients are there. Again, this is one of these things where, just like we were talking earlier here about, the uncanny valley of, AI video editing and generation and whatnot, is particularly when you're talking about like actually running these operations, for multi-million or multi-billion dollar marketing organization, your tolerance for error in there is probably such that we're probably a little bit of ways, from wanting to let, the AI agents run that stuff autonomously. They've got some work to do to prove that the reliability is going to be there. But I think directionally, yeah, it makes a ton of sense. Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting question as to, will this be a different layer of the tech stack? I think one of the things that's really interesting right now is there's not one agent platform out there. There's not like there's one home for agents. It's pretty much that every tool seems to be developing capabilities for its own agents. There's own standalone agents. The LLMs themselves are creating agents, and so I think one of the most interesting things is going to be like, okay, yeah, we've got all these like different agents out there, but what's the orchestration? And will that be the existing incumbent platforms, that have served as the orchestrators and sort of current go-to-market automation orchestration? I'm certain everyone who is an incumbent there wants that to be the case, but I think it would also be, again, to, Christensen disruptive innovation, like, yeah, are there other places where people might be trying to like serve as the ultimate orchestrator of these different agent capabilities? Personally, I would keep an eye on that.
I mean, so to an extent, you've just asked yourself the question that I wanted to ask next, which is, you referred to the importance of this orchestration and you kind of called it these coordinating centers of gravity. I thought that was a really good phrase in this big ops environment that provides cohesion and governance to the plethora of apps and agents and automations. And what does that look like? Is it just Workato on steroids that kind of is able to provide the API pathways for agents and other apps that are on the periphery to interact with each other and to take action? Is it something else that we don't really understand yet or haven't conceived of yet? What will it be?
Yeah. And this will be one of the things I will hesitate to make a prediction, because I think there's the old model, the way in which we would historically have thought of this is something that is a very clear conductor to the orchestra. Your example of like, Workato, is a version of that. I think what's interesting as a parallel is to consider what has happened at the data layer inside companies. So for a while, we had all these little mini databases attached to every single individual different app that lived in their own little silos. Now with APIs, more and more of those silos opened up. We started to, in particular with things like cloud data warehouses and lakehouses and things like that, be able to get, data, flowing more freely. But then the question became like, okay, we've now got all this data being generated or being used by different things throughout our organization, but how is this being orchestrated? And you've now seen multiple different architectures of how people think about dealing with that. Do we do it entirely through one central authority? Do we do it through this concept of data products, where different teams manage things as a product, interfacing to others? How much do you allow things to be federated? Where do you allow there to actually be redundancies or desyncs? Because in the grand scheme of things, what you're losing, from that redundancy is more than gained for, by the efficiency or the speed on some other level. I suspect it's going to be, if I had to take a guess, it would be something more like that, where, boy, this ability at the services layer, not the data layer, but the services layer, it is going to be a free flowing mechanism where like, hey, it's all in the cloud, anything can call anything else. So it's going to be then about the architectures we put around that. Will some of them be centralized? Yeah, I think those will be the simplest models. But could you imagine one where people start to actually design them as decentralized systems? Yeah, could see that. In fact, actually, again, like the larger you get as a company, it's almost like, we see this in the data products, side. It's just at some level, 100% centralized solution just becomes incredibly unwieldy, at this massive enterprise scale.
Unmaintainable. And To your point about like digital coworker, I had this chat with another founder who's working on an AI product, like an AI that has all the same context as you, that reads every email, that is in your project management system, that's getting all the tickets, that's getting the meeting notes or is attending the meeting, could take your job or could become this incredible resource to sort of dialogue with. Like, all right, what are we going to do? Like this kind of always on thought partner, working through problems with you. Like every person could have one. How much does that actually amplify the ability of a person? And it's hard to think of that being centrally coordinated. That's kind of like your AI mini-me in a way, sort of following you around and partnering with you. But that sort of surrealistic, kind of futuristic idea doesn't actually seem that far-fetched now, given everything we've talked about.
No, in fact, actually, this is, I would argue, one of the use cases people I talk to who are now doing a lot with AI, like it's one of the most reliable use cases is having these AI, again, like whether it's feeding it all of your own stuff or quite frankly, having it feed things of like, oh, well, this is everything I've ever received from my boss, and being able to like have these sorts of dialogues, it's like a Socratic method almost of, just how it changes our ability to look at things from like a different perspective. And because it's both got that combination of, we won't say it's omniscient, yet, but it's like, boy, it does have more data than pretty much any other human you would, talk to about that. But also, again, in an environment here where there's no emotion on the other side, there's no judgment, there's no, like privacy thing of like, yeah, now the AI is going to go like, whisper behind my back about that conversation. I mean, it's this amazing thing, I think, to give people a lot of freedom to just like creatively dialogue and explore different ways of looking at things, coming up with new ideas.
It really does feel to me that we're creeping closer and closer to having like the onboard ship's computer of Star Trek just available to us, where it's like you're talking to them like, computer, do this, do that, help me solve this problem, become this amplification and assistant. Do you ever sort of take a step, like sometimes when I think about these things, I'm like, this is like, yes, it could be weird and dystopian and there could be bad outcomes, but it's also just incredible like that this stuff exists right now. Like what timeline did we wander into that this is happening? It is so weird.
Yeah. Again, probably reaching too far back into the archives, but a very early Star Trek movie was Star Trek 4, where they travel in time to like what at the time was 1980s Earth, and was it Scotty? He has to interact with one of the computers. He's like trying to talk to it. The computer, the guy hands him the mouse. He's like talking to the mouse. Like, this is a huge big laugh line. Like, well, of course.
I think that's probably all that we have time for today. But Scott, thank you so much for chatting with me. Super interesting, super exciting. Again, I encourage everyone to read the full report. This is obviously a lot of detail that we didn't get to cover, but thank you for putting that out and being such a great resource to the marketing ops community. Hey everyone, I want to invite you over to the RevOps FM Substack community, where you can sign up to get rough transcripts, show notes, longer form articles, and other bonus content. Just head over to revops.fm/subscribe to get free access. I'd also love to know what you thought of the episode and to hear suggestions for topics you want to learn about. Feel free to leave a comment on Substack or send me an email at justin@revops.fm. Thanks for listening.